Elizabeth Taylor was dying, and with her, so was 20th Century Fox. It was March 1961, and inside a London hospital room, the world's most beautiful woman lay unconscious, a fresh tracheotomy scar carved into her throat. Doctors surrounding her bed unsure if she'd survive the night. Outside that hospital, studio executives faced a different kind of death, financial oblivion. They'd already spent millions on Cleopatra, a film that hadn't shot a single usable frame. The set stood empty in the cold British rain. Thousands of costumes hung untouched. An army of crew members collected paychecks while doing nothing. If Elizabeth died, the film died. If the film died, the insurance wouldn't cover the losses. If the insurance didn't pay, Fox would collapse. The world held its breath for Elizabeth Taylor that week, not just because they loved her, but because her heartbeat was literally keeping a Hollywood studio alive. When she finally opened those famous violet eyes days later, she didn't just survive pneumonia. She survived becoming the woman who would nearly bankrupt an empire with a single contract, a single illness, and a single forbidden love affair that would explode across Roman sets and scandal-hungry newspapers worldwide. If you're enjoying this story of Hollywood's most expensive disaster, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the golden age of cinema. $2 million. That was the number Darryl Zanuck wrote on the initial budget proposal for Cleopatra in 1958. It seemed reasonable, even conservative for a historical epic. Fox had made bigger gambles before. They'd survived them all. But what none of them understood that day was that they were about to greenlight the most catastrophic production in Hollywood history. A film that would consume budgets like a wildfire, destroy careers, birth scandals that would dominate headlines for years, and ultimately force one of the industry's most powerful studios to sell off its own land just to survive. The original plan was straightforward. Fox wanted to capitalize on the success of biblical epics like Ben-Hur. Audiences in the late 1950s couldn't get enough of ancient Rome and Egypt projected onto massive screens in glorious Technicolor. Cleopatra seemed like a natural choice, a legendary queen, romance, political intrigue, spectacular battles. Joan Collins was initially considered for the role. She was beautiful, talented, and crucially affordable. The budget would have stayed manageable. But Fox executives made a decision that changed everything. They decided they needed the biggest star in the world. They needed Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth had already proven she was box office gold. Her violet eyes were the most recognizable in the world. Magazine covers fought for her face, but Elizabeth wasn't interested in Cleopatra. She'd read the script and found it dull. When Fox first approached her agent, she turned them down. So Fox came back with a bigger offer. She turned them down again. Finally, Elizabeth's agent delivered what they thought would be the conversation-ending demand: $1 million. It was an astronomical sum in 1959. No actress had ever commanded such a fee. Fox executives looked at each other, calculated the risk, thought about the publicity such a salary would generate, and said yes. That decision set in motion a chain of events that would spiral into chaos. The $1 million salary came with clauses and stipulations that would haunt Fox for years. Elizabeth demanded percentage points of the gross revenue, overtime bonuses if filming went beyond schedule, first-class accommodations and approval rights over directors and co-stars. Most crucially, she demanded that filming could not take place in the United States because of tax reasons. This meant the entire production would need to be international, adding layers of complexity and cost that weren't factored into that initial $2 million budget. But Fox was committed now. They'd made Elizabeth Taylor the highest-paid actress in history. Now they just had to make the film. Production began in September 1960 at Pinewood Studios outside London. From day one, nothing went according to plan. The script still wasn't finished. Scenes were being written mere days before they were scheduled to shoot. The director, Ruben Mamoulian, found himself trying to choreograph elaborate sequences without knowing what came before or after them. Thousands of extras were hired and costumed for crowd scenes that kept getting postponed. Massive sets were constructed representing ancient Alexandria, built outdoors to save costs. But England in autumn doesn't resemble Egypt. The weather was cold, gray, and frequently rainy. Elizabeth showed up to set wrapped in coats. shivering between takes, struggling to deliver lines about the burning Egyptian sun while her breath created visible clouds in the freezing air. The costs mounted with terrifying speed. Every day of shooting that didn't result in usable footage was money vanishing into the British fog. Elizabeth's contract meant she was earning $50,000 per week regardless of whether cameras rolled or not. Fox executives back in Los Angeles received daily budget reports that made their blood run cold. 2 million had become 3 million, then 4, then 5, and they didn't have a single completed scene they felt confident about. Then Elizabeth got sick. It started as a cold, nothing serious. But the long hours in freezing weather weakened her system. By March 1961, Elizabeth Taylor was fighting for her life with acute pneumonia in the London clinic. Her fever spiked dangerously high. Doctors performed an emergency tracheotomy, cutting an opening in her throat to help her breathe. For several days, the prognosis was grim. Newspapers around the world ran headlines asking if Elizabeth Taylor would survive. Fox executives stayed by their phones, calculating the unthinkable financial consequences if she died. The insurance situation was a nightmare. If she died from the pneumonia, they might recover some costs. But all the money already spent on sets, costumes, and pre-production would be gone. The film would have to be canceled or completely restarted with a new star, a process that would cost millions more. Every day she remained hospitalized was another day of production shutdown, another $100,000 bleeding from Fox's accounts. The London sets stood empty. Rain soaked the plywood Alexandria. Elizabeth survived. The tracheotomy saved her life. Though it left a scar she would carry forever. But her doctors were clear. She could not return to work in England's climate. If Fox wanted to finish Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor, they would need to move production somewhere warm and dry, somewhere like Rome. The decision to move Cleopatra from London to Rome in summer 1961 was financially devastating. Everything built in England was essentially abandoned. The massive outdoor sets constructed over months at enormous cost were dismantled and left behind. New sets would need to be constructed from scratch at Cinecittà Studios in Rome. New crew would need to be hired. The budget, already hemorrhaging, was about to explode beyond anyone's worst projections. But Fox had no choice. They were trapped. They'd spent millions already. Elizabeth's contract meant walking away would cost them everything with no possibility of return. Their only path forward was through finish the film, release it, and pray it made enough money to justify the catastrophic costs. Richard Burton wasn't supposed to be in Cleopatra. Fox had initially cast Stephen Boyd as Mark Antony, but schedule conflicts required a replacement. Burton, a Welsh actor with a magnificent voice and growing reputation, was available. Fox hired him, flew him to Rome, and set up his first costume fittings. No one anticipated what would happen when Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton finally met on set. Both were married to other people. Elizabeth was still with Eddie Fisher, the crooner she'd controversially stolen from America's sweetheart Debbie Reynolds just 3 years earlier. Burton was married to Sybil Williams, his wife of 13 years and mother of his children. When filming resumed in Rome in September 1961, everyone expected professional behavior. Instead, they got the love affair that would define both stars' lives and add yet another explosive element to Cleopatra's already catastrophic production. The attraction was immediate and mutual. Between takes, they talked. Elizabeth found Burton's intellect intoxicating. He could quote poetry, discuss philosophy, match her wit. Burton found Elizabeth's beauty almost unbearable. Those violet eyes, that face that cameras worshipped, combined with a personality that was anything but delicate. She drank, she cursed, she challenged him. They began spending time together off-set, then more time. Then they weren't hiding it anymore. Cast and crew watched the relationship develop with a mixture of fascination and horror. Everyone knew this was going to explode publicly. Rome in the early 1960s was already the paparazzi capital of the world. When word began circulating that Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were having an affair on the Cleopatra set, every paparazzo in Italy descended on Cinecittà Studios like locusts. They climbed walls, bribed security guards, hid in trucks entering the studio grounds. They photographed Burton and Elizabeth in costume between takes. They followed them to restaurants. They camped outside Elizabeth's villa. The resulting photographs, Burton and Elizabeth holding hands, kissing, looking at each other with undisguised passion, appeared in newspapers and magazines worldwide. The scandal eclipsed everything else about Cleopatra. The Vatican issued a statement condemning Elizabeth's behavior as erotic vagrancy. American religious groups called for boycotts. Eddie Fisher, humiliated and heartbroken, remained in Rome trying desperately to save his marriage, even as the world watched it collapse in real time. Fox executives watched in horror as their already troubled production became a daily tabloid circus. But perversely, the scandal also generated publicity that money couldn't buy. Everyone in the world now knew about Cleopatra. Everyone wanted to see the film where this legendary affair had taken place. Director Mamoulian was replaced by Joseph Mankiewicz, a more experienced director. Mankiewicz looked at the footage shot in London and declared most of it unusable. Scenes would need to be reshot. The production schedule would need to expand further. Every revision, every reshoot, every extra week in Rome meant more money vanishing from Fox's diminishing reserves. By late 1961, the budget had reached $15 million, more than 7 times the original projection. Back in Los Angeles, 20th Century Fox was dying. The Cleopatra production had consumed so much capital that the studio couldn't finance other films. Projects were canceled. Actors were released from contracts. Fox became essentially a one-film studio, and that one film was an out-of-control monster consuming everything in its path. Spyro Skouras, Fox's president, watched his empire crumble. The studio had survived the transition from silent films to talkies, weathered the Great Depression, outlasted countless competitors. Now it was being destroyed by a single production about an Egyptian queen. The board of directors met in emergency sessions throughout 1962. Cleopatra's budget had now reached $30 million and showed no signs of stopping. Fox's other revenue streams weren't enough to cover the losses. The studio was carrying massive debt. Something drastic had to be done or Fox would declare bankruptcy within months. The solution was heartbreaking but necessary. Fox would sell its backlot. The massive 260-acre property in West Los Angeles where countless classic films had been shot would be liquidated to raise emergency cash. The sale was announced in 1962. Fox's backlot would be demolished and transformed into a commercial development that would eventually become Century City. The deal raised badly needed millions, but it also symbolized just how much Cleopatra had cost. Fox had literally sold its own land to finish one film. Hundreds of employees were laid off. The studio that had once been one of Hollywood's most powerful had been reduced to a desperate operation, betting everything on Cleopatra's eventual release, somehow justifying the apocalyptic costs. Elizabeth Taylor, meanwhile, continued earning her weekly overtime bonuses. By the time filming finally wrapped in 1962, Elizabeth had earned approximately $7 million from Cleopatra, roughly $70 million in today's currency. She'd become the highest-paid actress in history while simultaneously being part of the production that nearly destroyed the studio paying her. Filming officially wrapped in July 1962, but post-production required months more. Mankiewicz had shot an enormous amount of footage. Music needed to be composed. Sound mixing required months. The budget continued climbing. By the end, the true total cost reached $44 million, an unthinkable sum that would translate to roughly $500 million today. Cleopatra premiered in New York City on June 12, 1963. Reviews were mixed, but reviews almost didn't matter. Cleopatra was the most talked-about film in the world. The box office response was strong. It became the highest-grossing film of 1963, earning over $57 million in its initial North American release. But Fox needed extraordinary returns to justify extraordinary costs. Cleopatra hadn't made enough profit in its initial release to cover its production budget. It would take years of re-releases and television sales before Cleopatra finally moved into profitability. Fox survived, but barely. The studio's near-death experience became a cautionary tale that echoed through Hollywood for decades. Never again would a single production be allowed to grow so out of control. The era of unlimited studio power was ending, and Cleopatra had hastened its demise. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton married in 1964, divorced in 1974, remarried in 1975, and divorced again in 1976. Their relationship, born in the chaos of Cleopatra's production, remained tumultuous and passionate until Burton's death in 1984. Elizabeth would eventually acknowledge that Cleopatra changed her life in ways both wonderful and terrible. It gave her the great love of her life, but it also cemented her public image as a woman whose personal drama overshadowed her considerable talent. For 20th Century Fox, Cleopatra's legacy was equally complex. The film did eventually become profitable through decades of re-releases, but the studio never recovered its former dominance. The sale of the backlot, the layoffs, the years of financial struggle, these wounds took decades to heal. Cleopatra taught Hollywood an expensive lesson about hubris, control, and the dangers of betting everything on a single vision. It proved that even the mightiest studios could be brought to their knees by one out-of-control production. It showed that scandal could both destroy and save a film depending on how audiences chose to interpret it. And it demonstrated that sometimes the story behind the camera is more dramatic than anything that appears on screen. When the final accounting was done, one truth remained. Cleopatra had cost $44 million to produce, consumed a studio, destroyed careers, built careers, created one of the most famous love affairs in history, and proven that sometimes even Hollywood couldn't control the monsters it created. It was excess incarnate, ambition without limits, everything Hollywood represented, for better and worse, captured in 4 hours of Egyptian spectacle and forbidden passion. The world had never seen anything like it before. It never would again.